Chapter 2, in which Cimorene discovers the value of a classical education and has some unwelcome visitors. Inside, the hovel was dark and cool and damp. Cimorene found it a pleasant relief after the hot, dusty road, but she wondered why no sunlight seemed to be coming through the cracks in the boards. She was still standing just inside the door, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the dark, when someone said crossly, "Is that the princess we've been waiting for?" "Why don't you just ask her?" said a deep, rumbly voice. "I'm Princess Cimorene of Linderwall," Cimorene answered politely. "I was told you could help me." "Help her?" said the first voice, and Cimorene heard a snort. "I think we should just eat her and be done with it." Cimorene began to feel frightened. She wondered whether the voices belonged to ogres or trolls, and whether she could slip out of the hovel before they made up their minds about eating her. She felt behind her for the door and started in surprise when her fingers touched damp stone instead of dry wood. Then a third voice said, "Not so fast, Wrede. Let's hear her story first." So Cimorene took a deep breath and began to explain about the fencing lessons and the magic lessons and the Latin and the juggling and all the other things that weren't considered proper behavior for a princess. And she told the voices that she had run away from Say Them by the Mountains to keep from having to marry Prince Therendro. "And what do you expect us to do about it?" one of the voices asked curiously. "I don't know," Cimorene said, "except, of course, that I would rather not be eaten. I can't see who you are in this dark, you know." "That can be fixed," said the voice. A moment later, a small ball of light appeared in the air above Cimorene's head. Cimorene stepped backward very quickly and ran into the wall. The voices belonged to dragons. 5 of them lay on or sprawled over or curled around the various rocks and columns that filled the huge cave where Cimorene stood. Each of the males, there were 3, had short, stubby, sharp-looking horns on either sides of their heads. The female dragon had 3, one on each side and one in the center of her forehead. The last dragon was apparently still young to have made up his mind about which sex it wanted to be, and it didn't have any horns at all. Cimorene felt very frightened. The smallest of the dragons was easily 3 times as tall as she was, and they gave an overwhelming impression of shining, green scales and sharp silver teeth. They were much scarier in person than in the books she remembered from her natural history books. She swallowed very hard, wondering whether she really would rather be eaten by a dragon than marry Therendro. "Well," said the 3-horned dragon, just in front of her, "just what are you asking us to do for you?" Cimorene stopped, short as an idea occurred to her. Cautiously, she asked, "Dragons are fond of princesses, aren't they?" "Very," said the dragon, and smiled. The smile showed all of her teeth, but Cimorene did not find reassuring. That is, I've heard dragons who have captive princesses to cook for them, and so on," said Cimorene, who had had very little idea what captive princesses did all day. The dragon in front of Cimorene nodded. One of the others, a yellowish green in color, shifted restlessly and said, "Oh, let's just go on and eat her. It'll save the trouble." Before any of the other dragons could answer, there was a loud booming noise, and a 6th dragon slithered into the cave. His scales were more gray than green, and the dragons by the door made way for him respectfully. "Kazul," said the newcomer in a loud voice. "Achoo! Sorry I'm late, but a terrible thing happened on the way here. Achoo!" "What was it?" said the dragon, to whom Cimorene had been talking. "Ran into a wizard. Achoo! Had to eat him. No help for it. Achoo! Achoo! And now look at me." Every time the gray-green dragon sneezed, he emitted a small ball of fire that scorched the wall of the cave. "Calm down, Roxim," said Kazul. "You're only making it worse." "Achoo! Calm down. When I'm having an allergy attack? Achoo! Oh, bother." said the gray-green dragon. Somebody give me a handkerchief. Here, said Cimorene, holding out one of the ones she had brought with her. Use this. She was beginning to feel much less frightened, for the gray-green dragon reminded her of her great-uncle, who was old and rather hard of hearing, and of whom she was rather fond. What's that? Said Roxine. Achoo! Oh, hurry up and give it here. Kazul took the handkerchief from Cimorene, using two claws very delicately, and passed it to Roxane. The gray-green dragon moped his streaming eyes, and blew his nose. That's better, I think. Oh, drat. The ball of fire that accompanied the dragon's sneeze had reduced the handkerchief to a charred scrap. Cimorene hastily dug out another one and handed it to Kazul, feeling very glad that she had brought several spares. Roxane went through two more handkerchiefs before his sneezing spasms finally stopped. Much better, he said. Now then, who is this princess that lent me the handkerchiefs? Somebody's new princess, eh? We were just discussing that when you came in, Kazul said, and turned back to Cimorene. You were saying about cooking and so on. Couldn't I do that for one of you for a while? Cimorene said. The dragon smiled again, and Cimorene swallowed hard. Possibly. Why would you want to do that? Because then I wouldn't have to go home and marry Thranduil, Cimorene said. Being a dragon's princess is a perfectly respectable thing to do, so my parents couldn't complain, and it would be much more interesting than embroidery and dancing lessons. Several of the dragons made snorting, or choking noises. Cimorene jumped, then decided that they were laughing. This is ridiculous, said a large, bright green dragon on Cimorene's left. Why? Asked Kazul. A princess volunteering? Out of the question. That's easy for you to say, one of the other dragons grumbled. You already have a princess. What about the rest of us? Yeah, don't be stuffy, Warag, said another. Besides, what else can we do with her? Eat her, suggested the yellowish-green dragon in a bored tone. No proper princess would come out looking for dragons, Warag objected. Well, I'm not a proper princess, then, Cimorene snapped. I make cherries jubilee, and I volunteer for dragons, and I conjugate Latin verbs, or at least I would if anyone let me, so there. Here, here, said the grey dragon. You see, Warag said, who would want an improper princess? I would, said Kazul. You can't be serious, Kazul, Warag said irritably. Why? I like Cherry's Jubilee, Kazul replied, still watching Cimorene, and I like the look of her. Besides, the Latin scrolls in my library need cataloging, and if I can't find someone who knows a little of the language, I'll have to do it myself. Give her a trial run first, a purplish-green dragon advised. Warag snorted. Latin and Cherry's Jubilee, and for that you'd take on a black-haired, snippy little, I'll thank you to be polite when you're discussing my princess, said Kazul, and smiled fiercely. Nice little gal, Roxane said, nodding approvingly, and waving Cimorene's next to last handkerchief. Got sense. Be good for you, Kazul. If that's settled, I'm going to find a snack, said the yellowish-green dragon. Warag looked around him, but the other dragons seemed to agree with Roxane. Oh, very well, Warag said grumpily. It's your choice, after all, Kazul. It certainly is. Now, princess, if you'll come this way, I'll get you settled in. Cimorene followed Kazul around the cave and down a tunnel. To her relief, the ball of light came with her. She had the uncomfortable feeling that if she had tried to walk behind Kazul in the darkness, she would have stepped on her tail, which would not have been a good beginning. Kazul led Cimorene through a long maze of tunnels and finally stopped in another cave. Here we are, the dragon said. You can use the small room over on the right. I believe my last princess left most of the furnishings behind when she ran off with the knight. Thank you, Cimorene said. When do I start my duties, and what are they, please? You start right away, said Kazul. I'll want dinner at 7. In the meantime, you can begin sorting the treasure. The dragon nodded towards a dark opening on the left. I'm sure some of it needs repairing. There's at least one suit of armor with the leg off. Some of the cheaper magic swords are probably getting rusty. The rest of it really ought to be rearranged sensibly. I can never find anything when I want it. What about the library you mentioned? Cimorene asked. Well, we'll see how well you do on the treasure room first, Kazul said. The rest of your job I'll explain as we go along. You don't object to learning a little magic, do you? Not at all, said Cimorene. Good, it'll make things much easier. Go and wash up, and I'll let you into the treasure room so you can get started. Cimorene nodded and went to the room Kazul had told her to use. As she washed her face and hands, she felt happier than she had in a long time. She was not going to have to marry Theandril after all, and sorting a dragon's treasure sounded far more interesting than dancing or embroidery. She was even going to learn some magic, and her parents wouldn't worry about her once they found out where she was. For the first time in her life, Cimorene was glad she was a princess. She dried her hands and turned to go back into the main cave, wondering how to best persuade Kazul to help her brush up on her Latin. She didn't want the dragon to be disappointed in her skill. Draco draconem dracone, she muttered, and her lips curved into a smile. She had always been rather good at declining nouns. Still smiling, she had started forward to begin her new duties. Cimorene settled in very quickly. She got along well with Kazul and learned her way around the caves with a minimum of mishaps. Actually, the caves were more like an intricate web of tunnels, connecting caverns of various sizes and shapes that belonged to individual dragons. It reminded Cimorene of an underground city with tunnels instead of streets. She had no idea how far the tunnels extended, though she rather suspected that some of them had been magicked, so that when you walked down them, you went a lot farther than you thought you were going. Kazul's section of the caves was fairly large. In addition to the kitchen, which was in a large cave near the exit, so that there wouldn't be a problem with the smoke from the fire, she had a sleeping cavern, 3 enormous treasure rooms at the far end of an intricate maze of twisty little passages, 2 even more enormous storage rooms for less valuable items, a library, a large bare cave for eating and visiting with other dragons, and the set of rooms assigned to Cimorene. All the caves smelled of dragon, a somewhat musty, smoky, cinnamony smell. Cimorene's first job was to air them out. Cimorene's rooms consisted of 3 small connecting caves just off Kazul's living cavern. They were furnished very comfortably in a mixture of styles and periods, and looked just like the guest rooms in most of the modern castles Cimorene had visited, only without windows. They were much too small for a dragon to get inside. When asked, Kazul said the dwarves had made them in return for a favor, and the dragon's tone prevented Cimorene from inquiring too closely into what sort of favor it had been. By the end of the first week, Cimorene was sure enough of her position to give Kazul a list of things that she needed in the kitchen. The previous princesses, of whom Cimorene was beginning to have a very poor opinion, had apparently made do with a large skillet with 3 dents and a wobbly handle, a wooden mixing bowl with a crack in it, a badly tarnished copper tea kettle, an assortment of mismatched plates, cups, and silverware, most of them chipped or bent. Kazul seemed pleased by the request, and the following day Cimorene had everything she had asked for, except for a few of the more exotic pans and dishes. This made cooking considerably easier and gave Cimorene more time to spend studying Latin and sorting treasure. The treasure was just as disorganized as Kazul had told her, and putting it in order was a major task. It was sometimes hard to tell whether a ring was enchanted, and Cimorene knew better than to put it on to see. It might be the sort of useful magic ring that turned you invisible, but it also might be the sort of ring that turned you into a frog. Cimorene did the best she could and kept a pile in the corner for things she was not sure about. There was a great deal of treasure to be sorted. Most of it was stacked in one of the innermost caves in a large, untidy heap of crowns, rings, jewels, swords, and coins. But Cimorene kept finding things in other places as well, some of them quite unlikely. There was a small helmet under her bed, along with a great deal of dust, a silver bracelet set with opals on the reading table, and in the library, and 2 daggers and a jeweled inkpot behind the kitchen stove. Cimorene collected them all, along with the other things that were simply lying around in the halls, and put them back into the storerooms where they belonged, thinking to herself that dragons were clearly not very tidy creatures. The first of the knights arrived at the end of the 2nd week. Cimorene was busy cleaning swords. Cazul had been right about their condition. Not only were some of them rusty, but nearly all of them needed sharpening. She was polishing the last flakes of rust from an enormous broadsword when she heard someone calling from the mouth of the cave. Feeling somewhat irritated by the interruption, she rose and, carrying the sword, went to see who it was. As she came nearer to the entrance, she was able to make out the words that whoever it was shouting. "Dragon, come out and fight! Fight for Princess Cimorene of Linderwall!" "Oh, honestly," Cimorene muttered, and quickened her step. "Here, you," she said as she came out into the sunlight. Then she had to duck as a spear flashed through the air over her head. "Stop that!" she cried. "I'm Princess Cimorene." "You are?" said a doubtful voice. "Are you sure? Cimorene raised her head cautiously and squinted. It was still fairly early in the morning, and the sun was in back of the person standing outside the cave, so that it was difficult to see anything but the outline of his figure against the brightness. "Of course I'm sure," Cimorene said. "What did you expect? Letters of reference? Come around here where I can see who you are, please." The figure moved sideways, and Cimorene saw that it was a knight in shiny new armor, except for the legs, where the armor was dusty from walking. Cimorene wondered briefly why he hadn't ridden, but decided not to ask. The knight's visor was raised, and a few wisps of sandy hair showed above his handsome face. He was studying her with an expression of worried puzzlement. "What can I do for you?" Cimorene said, after several moments had gone by, and the knight still hadn't said anything. "Well, if you are the Princess Cimorene, I've come to rescue you from the dragon," the knight said. Cimorene set the point of the broadsword on the ground and leaned on it, as if it were a walking cane. "I thought that might be it," she said, "but I'd rather not be rescued. Thank you just the same." "Not be rescued?" The knight's puzzled look deepened. "But princesses always—" "No, they don't," Cimorene said firmly, recognizing the beginning of a familiar argument. "And even if I wanted to be rescued, you're going about it all wrong." "What?" said the knight, thoroughly taken aback. "Shouting, 'Come out and fight,' the way you did. No self-respecting dragon is going to answer a challenge like that. It sounds like a child's dare. Dragons are very conscious of their dignity. At least all the ones I've met so far are." "Oh," said the knight, sounding very crestfallen. "What should I have said?" "Stand forth and do battle," is the usual challenge," Cimorene said with authority, remembering her princess lessons. She had always been more interested in what the knights and dragons were supposed to say than in memorizing the places where she was supposed to scream. "But the wording doesn't have to be exact, as long as it's suitably formal. You're new at this, aren't you?" "Rescuing you is going to be my first big quest," the knight said gloomily. "You sure you don't want to be rescued?" "Quite sure," Cimorene said. "I like living with Cazul." "You like?" The knight stared at her for a moment. Then his expression cleared, and he said, "Of course! The dragons enchanted you. I should have thought of that before." "Cazul's not enchanted me, and I do not want to be rescued by anyone," Cimorene said, alarmed by the knight's sudden enthusiasm. "This place suits me very well. I like polishing swords and cooking cherries jubilee and reading Latin scrolls. If you don't believe me, ask anyone in Linderwall. They've been complaining about my unprincess-like behavior for years." I did hear something about fencing lessons," the knight said doubtfully. "But knights aren't supposed to pay attention to that kind of thing. We're supposed to be above rumors and gossip." "The fencing lessons were just the beginning," Cimorene assured him. "So you see why I'm perfectly happy being a dragon's princess." Yes," said the knight, but he did not look convinced. "Speaking of dragons, where's yours?" "Cazul is not my dragon," Cimorene said sharply. "I'm her princess. You'll never have any luck dealing with dragons if you don't get these things straight. She's gone to the enchanted forest on the other side of the mountains to borrow a creep pan, from which she knows. She's what? Said the knight. She's gone to borrow a crepe pan, Cimorene repeated in a louder voice. Perhaps you'd better have your helmet checked when you get back. They're not supposed to interfere with your hearing, but sometimes— Oh, I heard you, the knight said. But what does the dragon want with a crepe pan? She doesn't want it, I do. I found a recipe in the library that I want to try, and the kitchen just isn't equipped to handle anything but the most ordinary cooking. Kazul will fix that eventually, but for the time being, we have to borrow things like crepe pans and souffle dishes. You really do like it here, the knight said wonderingly. Cimorene refrained from replying that this was what she had been saying all along, and instead said, How did you know where I was? Things get around. The knight waved his hand in a vague manner. In fact, I had to hurry to make sure I was the first. Half of the kingdom of Linderwald and a princess hand in marriage is a reward rich enough to tempt a lot of people who wouldn't normally bother with this sort of thing. Father's ordered half the kingdom to whoever rescues me? Cimorene said incredulously. That's more than all my sister's dowries put together. It's the usual thing in cases like this, the knight said mildly. It would be, said Cimorene in tones of deep disgust. Well, at least you can go back and tell them I don't want to be rescued. Maybe that will keep anyone else from coming up here. I can't do that, the knight said. It's just night done. Cimorene finished. I understand perfectly. She gave him a polite farewell, more because she had been well brought up than because she felt like being polite, and sent him on his way. Then she went back into the cave and polished the broadsword until it was mirror bright, which relieved her feelings a little. There were 2 nights on the following day, and 4 more on the day after that. On the 4th day, there was only 1, but he was exceptionally stubborn, and it took Cimorene nearly 2 hours to get rid of him. By then, she was thoroughly disgusted, and even considered letting Kazul handle the nights from now on. She could not quite bring herself to do it, though. The knights would certainly attack Kazul as soon as they saw her, since that's what they were coming for, and sooner or later, someone would get hurt. Cimorene did not like to think that someone might be hurt trying to rescue her, particularly since she did not want to be rescued. So, with a sigh, she decided that she would continue to handle the knights as long as Kazul would let her. Prince Thranduil showed up at the end of the 3rd week. He was limping a little, as if his metal boots pinched his toes, and the feathers attached to the top of his helmet sagged badly. He stopped and carefully struck an imposing pose before issuing his usual challenge. Cimorene was not in the mood to be impressed. Besides, she could see that his helmet was a different style from his gold armor, and that the armor had gaps in the knees and the elbows where it didn't quite fit right. Aren't you a little slow? She asked irritably. There have been 8 nights before you. 8? The prince said, frowning. I thought by now there would have been at least 12. Perhaps I'd better come back. Cimorene stared at him in surprise. Why? Well, it would look better, Thranduil explained seriously. There's not much glory in defeating a dragon that hasn't already beaten 10 or 15 people at least. Sir Gorlax of Merstwood won't even consider going after a dragon whose score is less than 45. I don't want to risk waiting that long, but 8 just doesn't seem like enough. You're going to go away and wait until Kazul has defeated 50 knights before you come back to rescue me, Cimorene said. She found Thranduil's smug confidence very annoying, but she didn't like to say so straight out. Not if you'd rather be rescued now, of course, Thranduil said hastily, though you ought to consider the advantages, and I expect it won't be so very long. His voice trailed off, and he looked at her hopefully. I'm afraid it would be a very long time, Cimorene said with satisfaction. You see, Kazul hasn't defeated any knights at all yet. I thought you said there'd been 8, Thranduil sputtered. I said 8 of them had come by. I didn't say they'd fought anybody. I sent them away. You sent them away, Thranduil replied, plainly horrified. But that's not done, I know. Cimorene smiled sweetly. But I done it, and I intend to go on doing it. So, you might as well go home and warn your friends. They'd feel so foolish, if they came all this way into the mountains to rescue me, and then they had to turn around and go back home without doing anything. They certainly would, Thorndyll said indignantly. What do you mean by playing these kinds of tricks? Don't you want to be rescued? No, said Cimorene, losing her patience at last. I don't, and I'm tired of my work constantly interrupted, so please go away and don't come back. You can't possibly mean that, Thorndyll said. Besides, everyone expects me to rescue you. That's your problem, Cimorene told him. I'm going to go fix dinner. Goodbye. Before he could say anything else, she turned and ducked back into the cave, hoping the prince wouldn't follow.